Welcome everyone to this panel, which is part of the 2021 Pint of Science Festival. I'm really looking forward to this discussion all about conservation of biodiversity in Australia and how science has a crucial part to play in the fight for Planet A. Before we start, when we hold events at pubs around Australia, we ensure that we recognise the local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nation, one of many that makes up the continent that we now call Australia. And where I'm speaking to you from now is in Sydney, and that's Gadigal country. But now that we're holding this event online and our speakers and much of our audience are streaming from around Australia, we'd like to acknowledge all traditional custodians of country, the first innovators and scientists of this land. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present and emerging, and recognise their continuing relationship with the land, waters and culture. I'd also just like to acknowledge before we start tonight that our thoughts are with those in Melbourne who face another week of lockdown. So if you are joining us from Melbourne, we're thinking of you and we hope that you'll get through this. Hopefully online events like this can help you as well. My name's Joey Clarke. I'm an ecologist and I work as Senior Science Communicator at one of Australia's leading conservation groups, Australian Wildlife Conservancy. So to begin, I'd like you to cast your mind back to early 2020, before COVID-19 had even entered our consciousness, when the world's attention was on the bushfires that had devastated large swathes of the country. At that time, it was estimated that close to 3 billion animals had been killed or displaced that summer. Last year too saw about a quarter of the Great Barrier Reef suffer another severe bout of bleaching, the third mass bleaching event in 5 years. Now, it's a grim start, isn't it? Sadly, it's no surprise that Australia has one of the worst animal extinction rates in the world, in fact, the worst in the world for mammals. And as the human population expands, causing increased urbanisation, deforestation and climate change, the plight of our wildlife is both dire and urgent. The outlook is bleak, and yet there is hope. So in what way can clues from our history or messages in the media help us to take positive action? How can we use mathematical models and virtual laboratories as tools to combat further loss of species? And where is the line between the law and efforts to save our remaining species? Well, this evening, with answers to those questions, we're joined by four fantastic scientists working on the frontier of conservation in Australia. You'll also be able to ask your own questions through our live stream, and on Twitter, you can use the hashtag PintAU21. So hashtag PintAU21. Okay, I'd like to get straight into it and introduce our panelists. We're joined this evening by Dr. Erin Hahn, postdoctoral fellow at the Australian National Wildlife Collection. Hi, Erin. Professor Michael Bode, ARC Future Fellow in the Applied Mathematical Ecology Group at Queensland University of Technology. Hi, Michael. Elisa Bayraktarov, Program Manager at Eco Commons and Virtual Laboratories. And Dr. Lucy Richardson, postdoctoral research fellow at Monash Climate Communication Research Hub. Thank you for joining us to all of our panelists. And I think we might just start by getting you to introduce the work that you're involved in as it relates to conservation. So Lucy, if I can start with you, what does your work involve?
Who deliver those messages, so Australian Conservation Foundation and other groups like that. We also look at the media, how the media represents climate change in association with things like bushfires and how that might promote or not people taking action.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lucy. Erin, would you like to describe to us your workplace and the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. So I work at the CSIRO, specifically at the Australian National Wildlife Collection here in Canberra. Up until recently, I would have described what I do as conservation genetics. So I study genetics of populations of management concern, including threatened, endangered, or invasive species. And I look for patterns or clues in their DNA in order to answer questions related to how healthy animals are, where they were originally from, or who they're related to. And I use this information to give it to wildlife managers to make decisions about which species need the most help, who to breed with who in captive breeding programs, and perhaps how to move animals around in order to improve or maintain their health. I've been at CSIRO for a few years now, and there I've adopted a new description of what I do. I'm sort of a self-described professional conservation enabler. Because over the last decade, we've been bombarded with more and more evidence of environmental change. And I was feeling like studying a single species at one time wasn't really making a dent to prevent biodiversity loss. So what I'm doing now is developing laboratory methods that will help other researchers get more bang for their buck and produce results faster. So the preserved specimens that we have in our museum collections are a sort of time machine in order to look back at how historically species have coped with environmental change, or perhaps not. And so I'm looking at them through the lens of genetics in order to give that information to wildlife managers quickly so that they can make decisions in order to protect our biodiversity, if not rehabilitate it.
Thanks, Erin. That's fascinating. Elisa, can you tell us about your work and how that relates to conservation?
Yeah, of course. So I guess I have over the years become more of a data scientist. My background is in ecology and environmental modeling and monitoring. But over the years, I have really seen the potential of actually using data, interrogating data, questioning data, and visualizing data to really craft solutions for environmental problem solving, basically using data for conservation. So I probably describe myself a little bit as a data diplomat. In a past life, I used to convince a large number of people to share their highly sensitive threatened species data with my project, developing Australia's Threatened Species Index as a powerful communication tool in really showing how Australia's threatened species are going overall, which groups of species are most in need of our help, and where do we need to act now. And nowadays, I work more in the management of research. So I'm the program manager of the EcoCommons platform. The EcoCommons platform is building a national research infrastructure together with 9 different organizations. I myself am based at Griffith Uni, but we also collaborate with institutions like CSIRO, the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network, the Atlas of Living Australia, and many others to develop this natural research infrastructure. And what do? We basically create virtual laboratories that can be used by researchers, but also policy decision makers who want to spend less time on data wrangling and much more time on finding solutions to problems that are going to help us to protect the planet. So yeah, I work with a lot of, nowadays I work with a lot of software developers and scientists and science communicators. We're a pretty cool bunch of people.
That the data-driven approach is so important now in all aspects of what we do, but I'll be really interested to hear more about about how data is now making or driving conservation decisions. And finally, Michael, can you tell us about the work that you're involved with?
Yeah, thanks. I guess I just want to say I wish this was at the pub instead of another interaction on Zoom in the modern era. But it's good to see you all. Good to be here. I'm a mathematician, and so I guess I like the way that mathematics makes things more efficient. And so if you wanted to run your company more efficiently, you would hire a mathematician. If you wanted to make your conservation plans work more efficiently, you'd hire a mathematician. So I guess I interact with conservation in that sense, making things more effective or cheaper within the bounds of cost and budget and ecological constraints. But my recent interest is on, I guess, why people act illegally in conservation situations. We all know about organizations like Sea Shepherd who go and ram whaling ships. And we know about in the northwest of the United States, people used to ram stakes into trees to stop them being cut down. In Tasmania, people chain themselves to bulldozers into trees. People in conservation act illegally all the time. And it's a reflection of their feelings of frustration and of the unrecognized value of the assets they're trying to protect, and also the unrepresented nature of them. No one's standing up for these things. They can't stand up for themselves. And mathematicians are interested in games in the way that two people, when facing each other and trying to achieve sort of agreeing outcomes, when they really want something that the other group doesn't want, how they play that game. And acting illegally in conservation is a bit like that. The way that people poach wild animals from national parks, and the way they might reintroduce native species to national parks. Those things are all attempts to achieve an outcome in the face of somebody who doesn't want you to achieve that outcome. And so I like to apply game theory to the problems in conservation.
That's a fascinating field, and I think between the panel we could actually be here for hours. So we might get stuck into it. And Elisa, I thought I'd start with you. You're working with the data and looking at trends, especially with threatened species and how populations are doing over time. So can you paint a picture for us, just broadly, how is wildlife doing? How are we doing as, the job of conservation? Are we doing well or failing?
That's a big question. Let's see if I can stay as neutral and objective as possible, because that's what we do as scientists, right? We look at the facts and at the evidence. Okay, let's try to paint a picture here. So Australia has more than 1,800 threatened species, right? So in 2016, when my team started developing Australia's threatened species index, we started with the birds, threatened birds. Why? Because, well, there are so many bird watchers out there and people just love collecting data on birds. But it wasn't just about collecting data on birds. You had to actually go to the same place and repeat exactly the same way you were monitoring for that particular bird. And that's the data that we started integrating into the threatened species index. So 4 years later, we probably built the world's biggest database containing trends, time series information on threatened species. So we have first developed an index for threatened birds that was released in 2018. In 2019, we developed an index for threatened mammals. And as of end of last year, we also have an index for plants. And coming back to this 1,800 species that are currently on the Australian threatened species list, so we have about 250 species and subspecies in the threatened species index database. And basically what they're showing is, when it comes down to the birds, they have probably declined by about half between 1995 and 2017.
And is that an average for, if you took any threatened bird species, on average, it's declined that much? Is that what that figure means?
No, the index, what the index is doing is integrating time series information from many species. It's a multi-species index. Okay. I think the bird index contains something like 64 different birds. And what it builds is it builds first trends for all the individual species, and then it builds the average across all of those species together. So yeah, basically birds have declined by about 50%. With the mammals, we have seen declines of about a third in the last 20 years or so. And the largest declines we've observed for threatened plants. So they have basically decreased by almost 3/4 between 1995 and 2017. So looks like we are not doing that well, especially for Australia's threatened plants.
Yeah, okay. It's interesting too to look at how different populations are going. And I know that for mammals, there was a big difference between populations that are out in the wild and ones where there have been active management interventions. So, at AWC, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, we do a lot of reintroductions into large feral predator-free fenced areas. And for populations of some of those threatened mammals, if you look at the population level, they're actually going okay. And yet the bigger picture, outside of those havens is one of decline. So I think that emphasizes how important intervention can be when we're facing, really a lot of declines out there in the natural world. Erin, I thought I'd come to you, and your work, you talked about the Australian National Wildlife Collection. For people who aren't familiar with that, it's essentially like a library, but instead of books, you've got lots of dead animals, right? There's drawers full of animals that have been collected from around the country over a couple of hundred years. What's it like to be working in that environment, surrounded by this wildlife that's not necessarily still out there in the same abundance as when it was collected?
I think likening it to a library is quite accurate. Sometimes I think of it as a very quiet zoo. But in our collection, we have halls of drawers of birds where I can confirm the interest in birds, especially here in Australia. We have quite a large collection of birds. So we have specimens covering not just Australia, but lots of Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, representations of populations over the last 100 or so years. We also have a very large collection of specimens in jars, which is what I spend a whole lot of time looking at. So those would be the specimens that we've fixed with formalin and then popped in ethanol. So while they're not quite as pretty as a bird that's been posed so that you can look at its feathers, they do preserve the morphology of and the internal organs of the specimen much, much better. We also have an entire collection of skeletons and bones and skulls, because we want to be able to look at different aspects of the phenotype of the animals and how they might have changed over time. And so while I work at a wildlife collection, there's collections all over Australia, and they preserve specimens in different ways. So we have insects preserved in one way. You see the little pins of specimens of moths or butterflies that you might have seen before. As well as plants. So it's really the job of museum curators to go out and have a representation of Australia.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and we'll come back to how that acts as a reference, quite like a library, what we can actually learn from those specimens. But first, I'm interested, Michael, in the work you've been doing recently about illegality, and in particular, your recent paper, which suggested that some people have been motivated to act outside the law to achieve a conservation outcome. And this hypothetical situation of reintroductions, I mentioned the reintroductions that we're involved with, but you're saying that some people are actually motivated to carry out kind of guerrilla reintroductions, not big apes, but outside the law reintroductions. Is that something that you think is a likely prospect in Australia?
Yeah, it's already happened a couple of times in Australia that we know of. So, people have found Tasmanian devils wandering around the forests of Victoria. They've found physical living devils. So someone's been introducing them somewhere. And we know that they were introduced to Badger Island in the Bass Strait probably sometime in the 1990s. No one quite knows who did it or why they did it, but they were there. They were taken off, in fact, and dumped back on the Tasmanian mainland into populations infected by devil fatal tumour disease by the Tasmanian government. But I like the way that this conversation splits us into people who watch things go down. Because the reason I'm interested in like illegal actions in conservation is because some people look at the state of conservation, the way that every species is on its way down to extinction, besides chickens, beef cattle, and humans. And I guess, as scientists, we have this desire to either watch it happen, to create threatened species index that watch these things decline, or like me, produce mathematical models that forecast that decline 10 years into the future. Or we might produce a museum where we can see the exhibits of the animals that were existing and are now extinct. And I guess, AWC, the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, and guerrilla conservationists are much more active in the way they want to change things, right? They want to get in there and get their hands dirty. And I don't know how I feel about that, because I'm more of a watcher than a doer, but I find it very interesting to think about philosophically what might motivate people to do these things. And I also find it interesting to think about how people who want the same outcomes as us, right? They want animals back in the Australian landscape. They end up quibbling much more about the methods than they do about the outcomes. So you guys put stuff in fences, and for a long time, even now, that's considered to be like is that really truly back in the wild? And we say the same things about zoos. So, like the species are not extinct, but it's entirely in captivity. Is that extinct, or is it in the wild? And we worry about whether something was introduced into, say, the UK landscape, where they recently reintroduced beavers, but in the past they've reintroduced illegally polecats, possibly goshawks, almost certainly wild boar. they're talking about doing it for lynx, wolves. Like, I guess some people want to do things and some people want to watch, and I wonder where I stand in that particular balance.
Yeah, very interesting. And I think that's a nice segue to hearing Lucy about how people respond emotionally and psychologically to this issue of biodiversity in crisis. And, we've heard from Erin and Elisa that it really is a crisis, that we are losing species in front of our very eyes. Have you noticed a shift in that response, in how the public responds to that loss of biodiversity, and how individuals respond as well, and whether they're motivated or just depressed?
There's a new concept in psychology that's come out recently where they actually talk about eco-anxiety, so an ecological anxiety. And this is about worry, deep concern, anxious worry about the future of our world and the environment of our planet. And it can be quite debilitating. And so trying to understand how people in this sector, like, for example, some of these, the NGOs that are out there, Wildlife Conservancy, how the people in those groups keep going and going and going in the face of these continuing declines. And it's a really interesting space, and not one that we've necessarily got answers for. But yeah, there is a lot of concern, and you see it in the polls that are done. What does Australians think about climate change? What do they think about the environment, laws and policies? And we do see rising concern. Yes.
Yeah, and I think we were talking a bit before this session just about biodiversity crisis being recognised, I think, more in the public discourse as something at the level of climate change, as an existential threat. That biodiversity loss is one of those planetary boundaries that if we cross, there's no going back, and extinction is a one-way street. So I think more and more there is a better or a more informed public discussion about that. But I think it is so easy to be pessimistic about these things. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the research shows that framing it in a way of motivation, of optimism, that something can be done, gets people more enthused, but also gets better outcomes on the ground.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of research that talks about if you can give people, give them hope by giving them options of solutions and things they can be doing, that can actually be really beneficial. There's also research looking at how we talk about things, like, for example, climate change. So we did a comparative study looking at how the media talked about the Black Saturday bushfires from 2009 and how they talked about the Black Summer bushfires in that 2019-18 period. And we saw huge shifts in how they talked about it. So we saw that there was a lot less denial of climate change. There was a lot more discussion around diverse impacts of climate change. So it wasn't just oh my goodness, we've got fires, hey, climate change is a thing. It was a lot more things like biodiversity, it was human health, and these kinds of broadening of the narratives, the broadening of the discussion around other impacts actually really gives us the chance to engage sectors of the community that might not have been previously engaged. I mean, you probably couldn't find anyone who if you said, are you worried about your health, they would say, oh no. Or are you worried about your community's health? And they'd say, oh no, that doesn't worry me at all. Very few people don't have concern for their community and their neighbours, their family, their friends.
So Lucy, can I interrupt? Sorry.
Yeah, please.
What do you do when the situation is really dire? So if I think about the continent of Africa, it's one of the last bastions of megafauna, of biodiversity, and the recent UN projections of population there said that in the next 50 years, you're going to see an extra 1 to 3 billion people. It's actually quite much more narrow than that, but like an enormous increase in the population. I mean, the effective human population increases in density and increases in number are fairly deterministic, right? There's no question that if more people pack into the same space, there's less room, less resources for biodiversity. Do we not talk about the fact that we're not going to see giraffes in the wild, we're not going to see migrations of wildebeest, we might see the end of rhinoceroses or do we avoid it, or do we try and frame it in a positive way? Where's the out there? Like, isn't it just a negative story from start to finish?
Yeah, you can't ignore it. People need to know it's an issue, or nobody would bother acting anyway. So you do need to know it's an issue. You also need to talk about options. And there's a difference too between science can tell you what the problem is, it can give you a range of solutions, but policy and approaches that decision makers take is a lot more complex. There's a lot more factors they consider, just how they do it and what the community's value influences which solutions get chosen. And so unless people are valuing those things and valuing them more than something else, then getting those kinds of policy decisions in place can be very, very difficult. And that's one of the things where, when capitalism is king, that's what we see. We see that development go ahead and, sure, we'll offset that biodiversity over there. That's all cool. And so these kinds of things are problematic when you get to that policy level.
It's interesting to think about those different contexts, and being able to do conservation in the way that we do in Australia is a bit of a luxury. We're a first world with a high level of wealth, so we're able to invest in good conservation projects around the country. But we still face these situations where there are critical decisions that have to be made. And I'm interested especially in when populations get very small. And Erin, maybe you'd like to comment on this, just about what genetics can tell us. Sometimes you have to toss up between saving one thing or another, or you have to dedicate resources to one population over another. How does genetics work to inform those really difficult decisions?
Well, unfortunately, by the time most populations get to the point where you are enacting some kind of intervention, they're already in a lot of trouble and can be in a lot of trouble genetically. We can look at a population and determine how inbred it is, and that would kind of give you a sense of urgency and also help you guide if you were to be engaging in captive breeding, say which individuals to breed with whom in order to minimize the detrimental effects of inbreeding. Another thing that genetics can do is when you have a population that you're raising in captivity that is doing quite well, it can help you guide where to reintroduce it, because you might have had a population that has shrunken to a point where it's so small that you don't have any evidence of where it existed previously. And you can use lots of sources of information, but you can go into museums and you can find evidence of which population kind of matches the one that you have in captivity, so that you can put it back into the wild and say, this is the environment it came from. It's probably most well adapted to it. We can just hope that the environment still looks like that, and that would give them a better chance at succeeding.
Interesting. And Elisa, from you, you're looking at these trends at a very large scale. Is that data able to be used to inform intervention? So, if you can look at a species and see that it's trending down, are there thresholds where you can say, at this point, we need to step in and do something? Is that how some of this threatened species index data could be applied?
I feel thresholds are a little bit arbitrary. I mean, you can definitely see how certain groups of a taxonomic group are doing. For instance, we know that amongst the birds, the shorebirds are actually the ones that are showing the most declining trends. We were seeing declines of up to 80-90% over the last 20 years or so. And we sort of know where that comes from. It's because their habitat has been degraded quite severely, and many shorebirds actually come and basically travel between Australia and the Yellow Sea. So it becomes suddenly not just an Australian problem, but a global problem where you really need to involve other international stakeholders if you really want to halt this declines and do some management to bend the curve. Actually, that's something that I really want to talk to you about, bending the curve. So over the last couple of years, I've been looking at hundreds of declining trends. And I was really hoping to find some hope about how do we actually bend the curve of biodiversity decline. And then last year, I found this incredible paper that was actually proposing how we do it. Simple. You just have to do 3 things. Number 1, increase conservation efforts. And that's everything from management, what you're saying, Joey, but also start to restore habitats, bring back the habitat that species have lost, and also landscape level conservation planning. So plan for the future. plan for a brighter future, not just for us, but also for everything, for animal and ecosystem. Number 2, sustainable production. So we're so good at doing research. Why not do a little bit more research about sustainable increases in agricultural productivity and also improving the trade of agricultural goods? And number 3, sustainable consumption. So what do we have to do to really reduce the waste of agricultural products and goods, and how do we make it easier so that the food lands basically from agriculture, from the field to the fork, but also how do we lower our intake of animal calories? So I'm not saying we all should become vegans, but I'm saying that perhaps considering reducing the intake of animal calories, eating meat, especially red meat, might help. And that paper that came out last year suggested that those 3 things combined could help to bend the curve, to finally see an increase in biodiversity in the future. So I'm hopeful that we can do it together, fighting for planet A, right?
Yeah, there we go.
I have a question related to that, if you don't mind me jumping in. One of the things that I find very, very interesting is how often we don't talk about population, human population. So as Michael was saying about, as these populations grow in these countries, it needs more land for agriculture, for housing, etc. It's a very controversial topic to talk about any kind of prevention, reduction, loss of control. And I think it's a conversation we really need to be having in some way, because it is a huge pressure.
Yeah, that's interesting. We're planning to manage these populations of threatened species in an interventionist way, and yet any discussion about that with humans and overabundant species, you get voted out straight away. It's very unpopular. I'm interested, Elisa, you talked about 3 steps, and you made it sound really simple, that we actually have a lot of the solutions. We understand what needs to be done by and large, and sometimes I feel a bit frustrated by that too, that there is this huge body of research churning out papers about understanding little relationships ecologically, and Michael, you might like to jump in here too, just that don't we understand broadly what we need to be doing, and isn't it time to actually translate that into work on the ground?
Yeah, depressingly, that's more the job for the psychologists and the social scientists than it is for the ecologists and the biologists. Like, we stopped clearing land, we stopped crapping CO2 into the atmosphere, and we didn't grow our population and increase our consumption. I think we've been mostly done. And, encouraging a large number of people with independent values to do that is the trick, especially when they're being competed, when your messaging is being competed with by advertising companies and really great new telephones. And so, Lucy had a crack at capitalism, which I kicked that thing. But some of the worst abuses of the environment over the last 100 years have been by authoritarian, socialist governments, China and Russia among them, or the USSR. And I think the problem is more intrinsic to humans' desire to acquire stuff than necessarily how we structure our economy and government.
Yeah,
just blackpilling.
There's a lot of research around how to basically saying that a lot of it's a communication gap. There's a communication problem. People aren't actually, we have solutions. It's the same for climate change. We know what needs to be done. Technology exists that can be doing this. It's a case of getting it there. And so how do we communicate with people in a way that resonates, that provides them with the information they need for the decision they're making, that helps them achieve that? But there's also the supporting infrastructure. So, it's all very well to encourage people to use public transport, but if there's no public transport in your city, you can't do that one. So what else can we be doing? And so there's a whole infrastructure that sits behind people taking action. If I'm in an apartment, I don't have a backyard to encourage birds. I've got this little patio. What can I be doing or not doing? How do I need to talk to my local council about what they do on their properties, or do you know what I mean? So helping people understand what they can be doing within their limitations is, I think, a pretty critical gap.
But in the end, doesn't it all come down to values. I mean, and this is an area where I'm leaving my scientific expertise next to me, and I'm beginning to be a human. I mean, what is really important to you guys? I mean, do you love diving in coral reefs? Do you love watching birds? I mean, how come Australia doesn't value as a whole, as a country, doesn't value the environment and animals and birds and plants as much as other countries, for example, in the world? Or, well, how come that we invest, for instance, only 10% of the funds that are invested by other countries into conservation and protecting species to become extinct, like, for example, the United States? And there I'm just asking myself, yeah, what do people really care about? What do you guys care about?
I would argue that the Australian people care a whole lot about the environment, and they love doing all those things that you just said. And it's not so much that they don't care, it's that we take it for granted, that it's there. And it isn't until events such as like the bushfires last year where we start to see those evidence of change knocking on our doors. But I see here a real opportunity for hope in the upcoming generation. If you talk to kids, they know what's going on. They're aware of the biodiversity crisis. They've grown up with climate change. And at every opportunity, they're looking for things that they can do because they've grown up with this. Whereas, most of us came around to understanding what climate change is, if at the earliest, maybe the 90s. And I'm really quite optimistic here that the upcoming generation is going to bulldoze us with change, and we have to make room and allow that to happen because, young Australians want that. And we just need to make sure that there are policies in place that enable them to make it happen. Because like you said, we know what needs to happen. These are relatively easy fixes, and we just need to have a bunch of highly motivated people to get it done.
I think if only we had like 30, 40 years to wait, right? Like the median age of a politician in Australia is in the mid-60s. And so I agree that these people, that the young generation, and hopefully they'll stick with it when they get older and have a different sort of life around them. But I think they'll have a different attitude towards climate change no matter what their age is going to be. But for the next 20 critical years, it's going to be... I'm just being negative here. This is a pessimistic thing. They're going to start voting in about 5 years, so I guess maybe that'll change some things. I hope they do start voting. That'd be good.
We've raised some enormous questions here, and as predicted, I think we could talk for hours. But we've also had questions coming in from the audience, and for people who are watching, you can type questions in the comments section below the YouTube stream or on Twitter. So use the hashtag PintAU21. So we might come to some of those questions to stimulate further discussion, even though I think we've got lots to cover as is. Okay, so just a very basic one of what are some examples of threatened species and the threats they're facing. Before I come to that, I might just remind everyone that Elisa raised some points about food shortage and food production systems. And I'd like to direct the audience to another panel that happened the other night as part of Pint of Science, Thought for Food, and that's on the YouTube channel. So you can catch up on that one at Pint of Science YouTube channel. So yeah, interested to hear some real, actual examples of species that each of you have worked with. Michael, we heard about the devil, but what are some good examples, some positive examples of things that are working, or other species which are really disappearing to extinction, and why that might be and what might work? Anyone can jump in here.
Positive examples, right? Okay, so I live in Brisbane, Queensland, where there is this island called Stradbroke Island, and there is a Point Lookout where actually citizen scientists have started counting the whales that were migrating north and south. So every time the whales have to migrate, they basically have to go through this very narrow passage, and there is no way that a person couldn't count the entire population of the whales. And after, I think in the 70s, there was a ban on fishing of whales in Australian waters, and that has caused huge improvements for this humpback whales. So the numbers were basically boosting over the last 30 years. So that population really has increased dramatically. And that was just a matter of getting a ban on fishing, of whale fishing, whaling.
So, that's a great example where it's, it's very clearly understood there's one major threat. You do something to deal with that threat or manage it, come up with a system that works better, and recovery takes place. It sounds sort of straightforward in that case. And obviously some of the threats are more complex than that. But I think, like a lot of the work that AWC does is simply about understanding the threatening processes, getting people on the ground, and, managing things in a way. And, a lot of the land management practices we do emulate to some extent the way that Indigenous Australians looked after the country as well. So, fire management is a critical part of looking after Australian ecosystems and landscapes. So, I think there are lessons there too. Who else has an example of something good that's going on in conservation and why they think that's working?
I have a positive story to add. So you can probably hear it in my voice. I'm from the United States, so this is from the US where I did my PhD work. But I worked with a population of endangered pronghorn, so they're antelope, and the population in southern Arizona had been reduced to just 21 individuals. And it was at such a crisis point that a management agency was formed, and they rounded up as many individuals they could to create a captive breeding program. The pronghorn had been driven to this point over a very long period of time due to overhunting and destruction of their habitat, but a period of drought dramatically reduced their population so that they had to intervene. And over a course of a few years, they were able to supplement the population with water and food and boost it back up to hundreds of individuals, to the point where they could get them and re-release them out into the wild. And they're doing really well now with like hundreds of individuals. But it was that critical point where they needed help, because the population had gotten so small and the environment had shifted so much from what they were well adapted to that they needed to get over that point of inflection. And the really worrying thing is that we're having more and more instances now of these extreme environmental events. And so more and more species are needing our help. But we have good evidence from sort of examples like the pronghorn that with the right intervention, you can kind of get them through the hardest parts.
There we go. It's not that hard telling good stories. Everyone's got something. We've had another question here for Erin that has come in from the audience, and sorry to take this to a dark place again, but just about the scale of extinctions at the moment and whether this current crisis that we face with biodiversity should be considered a mass extinction. Does it rank with those extinctions of the past?
Absolutely. Lots of people are starting to call this the sixth extinction, and it's something that we refer to quite often. And it's different because this one we have control over and we can do something about it. And I think that we need to be thinking of it on the scale of a mass extinction to really drive home the level of catastrophe that we're facing. Sorry to take it to a dark place. Yes.
No, that's our audience taking it there, and we can't control what they're asking.
See, they
keep
care.
the questions coming in too for everyone who's watching at home. Another question here, and I think Lucy will be well placed to have some input on this, and we touched on it a little bit earlier, just about the differences between generations and their attitudes to wildlife conservation, also climate change, but does that give you much hope when you're speaking to younger generations? Do you think they are more aware?
I probably can't speak to the biodiversity questions. The data sets that I look at are specific to climate change, but absolutely they are much more aware, much more emotionally engaged, and yeah, very, very concerned, more so than the older generations, which isn't to say that there aren't people within the older generations that are very, very concerned, but at a generational level, the scale, they're much, much more concerned and worried, anxious, angry, everything.
Okay, so as long as that can be, and you talked about that communication gap, if that can be translated into action and motivation and changing systems, then possibly that's possibly that's good news. Might be a win.
Yeah.
And yeah, Michael, I'm really interested in that paper, and we've talked about it a little bit, but those gorilla reintroductions. Do you think? I'm just wondering what you think the scope for that is. Like, Australia is very well regulated in the space of conservation, so all of the work that we do with translocations, there's lots of hoops to jump through, lots of regulations. Do you see a future where there's lots of kind of unlawful conservation actions to the point where they make a real difference?
We already do, right? Like a bunch of people, not conservationists, released foxes into Tasmania sometime in the past 2 decades that threaten 10 species of extinction. People on the other side of conservation seem quite willing to break the law to damage, biodiversity. So the idea that we would feel reticent about it is kind of strange. I would say 3 things. One, when this stuff happens, when people take the law into their own hands and introduce animals they're not allowed to, it tends to be after they've been told they're not allowed to do it by the authorities. So someone will apply through the normal channels to release an animal into the wild because of a conservation goal. They'll be told no because, in my humble opinion, risk-averse public servants have nothing to benefit from a risky action. And so after a few attempts, they'll just go ahead and do it. There's really great quotes from conservationists in the UK about beavers, where they said, look, you can let us do it or we'll do it, but those are your 2 options. And the second thing I note is that if you were, anyone out there, to choose to translocate an animal from a place where it exists but is threatened to somewhere where it doesn't currently exist, may once have existed, could potentially exist in a future climate or future sort of biodiversity environmental scenario, you would probably face a $5,000 fine. So something that you would also get if you ran a red light 6 times in a row. And we could think of that as being society's opinion about the severity of that offense. If you, for example, in America were to stick a metal pole into the center of a tree in a native rainforest that was being threatened by logging, you might go to jail for decades. That's something that society has deemed very, very bad. In Australia, if you were to, for example, bring an invasive species into our country and release it into the wild, you would probably face a pretty light slap on the wrist. And the people who do these things know that. And I feel like if conservation is to play in a level field, then maybe we should think about what those signals are as well. I mean, that said, so here's my point. Because that's a really irresponsible thing to put forward. I think that if people are willing to do this after they are told through a regulated channel that they're not allowed to, the regulators ought to consider the possibility that if they say no to a overseen, risk-managed, regulated release by an organization that you respect and has a great track record of doing this, they would not necessarily not see the reintroduction. They would possibly just see it happen in an unregulated way. And I think that should really encourage us to be more ambitious about conservation, because the problems are very large.
On that, I would like to add something, and that is, let's see if I can challenge you, Michael. I think in order for you to break the law, there must already be a law in place that is being enforced. And that seems not to be, the environmental law in Australia seems not to be very effective and efficient. Perhaps some of you have heard of the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. It's been brought into the Constitution in 1999, so it's been now acting for over 20 years. And there were some studies that were actually showing that since the EPBC Act has been acting, basically a threatened species habitat as large as Tasmania has been lost or destroyed because the environmental laws were just not effective to protect species. So I think that's a problem. And the EPBC Act, interestingly, gets reviewed every 10 years. So it was it came into place in 1999, and then it was reviewed first in 2010. And now we just had a second review of the EPBC Act. And the outcomes from that independent review were actually quite sobering. They say that the EPBC Act is pretty much outdated, and there is a fundamental reform needed if we really wanted to make it of use to protect species from becoming extinct.
Yeah, and that, the whole legal aspect is a whole other, aspect of conservation that we haven't got time to go into this evening. We've got another really interesting question here, and I recently rewatched Jurassic Park. And Erin, as someone who works with DNA, with genetic codes of things that are extinct, but also things that are very rare, do you think there is any prospect that for things that are either vanishingly rare or already extinct, that we might be able to revive or de-extinct some of those species?
This is so interesting because I get this question every single time I visit schools, and it's usually from the kids who are just of the age who have seen Jurassic Park. So I think the question about whether or not we can de-extinct a species is one thing. The other idea is, should we? Because the species went extinct for a reason, and it's probably because we've destroyed its habitat so much so that it can't survive there anymore. So if we were to bring back a species, or to bring back another species that's closely related but serves the same function, the same ecological function, we have to make sure that it's going to do well in that environment. So I think there's a bit of an ethical question, aside from whether or not we should be developing super velociraptors, is it the best expenditure of our scientific resources, and is it going to be good for the animals to be reintroduced there? Because you could be bringing back species that the other community members haven't seen in a really, really long time and might not be well suited for anymore.
It sounds like a no then.
Maybe we'll have some people out there engineering Tyrannosaurus Rex on the illegal end.
Yeah,
Please
don't. I'd just like to see a thylacine. We were so close, and the recent paper that came out suggested they might have survived, or they likely survived up to the 80s or the 90s. They might have still been around in my lifetime. And it's tantalizing to think that we were so close with that species, and whether today we could intervene and actually breed them up from a small number of individuals. Sadly, I think the lesson we learned there is once they're gone, once it gets to zero, there's no going back. We're going to have to wrap things up shortly, but before we do, we've touched on some very big philosophical issues about extinction and conservation, and I think we've talked a lot about how there are systems that need to change if we're going to see a positive future and restore biodiversity around the world. On an individual level, I'm interested in what you think each of us should be doing to try and promote biodiversity, to improve how conservation is done. And I'll indulge myself a little bit here and just say that if you want to support organisations that are doing conservation work, that's one way that you can get involved, and AWC is a good place to start. But on an individual level, anyone jump in here, what do you think is the most valuable thing to be doing for conservation?
Become a citizen scientist. Become a volunteer. Give something back. Do something for the environment. The more you learn about nature, about an ecosystem, about an animal, the more interesting it becomes to you. The more you start caring about it. And there is so much beauty out there, and there is so much to do. And there's always hands needed when it comes down to conservation. So yeah, join AWC. Join the Bush Heritage. Join BirdLife Australia. Go out and join your local citizen science group.
Yeah, and there's great opportunities for that with things like the Great Aussie Bird Count. There are various projects where you get to identify camera trap images and try and work out what animals have been detected there. All of that, it's not only helpful for the researchers, but also, like you said, engenders empathy for those species and familiarity, which makes people care about them, hopefully. Erin, what do you think is the most important thing we should all be doing?
So, like I said, I think that most Australians care And the mismatch between what's being done about the problem and what is perceived as the problem might be that we just need to voice that we care more. And you can do that in a lot of different ways. You can obviously get involved in organizations like yours, and you can put your money where your mouth is. You can decide to buy products that you believe are less detrimental to the environment. You can call up your bank and see what their investment practices are, and you can make little steps every so often. What I like to do is I like to pick a thing once a month and say, I'm going to find a way to do that better. And so, maybe instead of using Q-tips, disposable Q-tips, I'm going to go get reusable ones this month or something. So I try to make little incremental steps so that it doesn't seem like a monumental task to have to absolutely uproot everything you do, but just make your voice heard whenever you can.
It's a lot of pressure trying to deal with an extinction crisis on your own, but those small steps can make you feel better and feel like at least you're not adding to that problem. Lucy, what do you think people should be doing as individuals that might make a difference?
I think finding out, like doing some research online, what things can I be doing? If there's a particular type of animal that you're interested in, I love birds or I love bees, have a look at what you can be doing in your local area, whether it's in your own home, what your local council might have. They might have tree planting sessions, they might have whatever. Being amongst community, finding a community, others who are interested in similar things can really boost that morale and give you extra impetus to keep going when it feels like things are too tough.
Yeah, that community is, I think that's proven that if you're among people that are like-minded, that are working together for a shared cause, it's much easier to feel optimistic and hopeful about where things are going. And Michael, what animals do you think we should be smuggling and where to, and where should we release them?
I reckon there's two problems with the world today, two problems with like the planet A we're in. And one is we're crapping on the climate, and the other is that we're losing this incredible legacy and heritage of evolutionary diversity and biodiversity that we've been given by luck. And I think in the first case, you should just offset your entire carbon emissions every year by purchasing credits in an exchange to EU trusts, because that's a personal action you can take to support a net negative zero. And with biodiversity, I like Elisa's point. I think the weird thing about biodiversity is we don't need most of it. There's a ton of it that's actually completely superfluous. And the only thing it adds to our life is a feeling of enrichment and beauty and oneness with like the 4 billion years we've been here on this planet as a living set of organisms. And the only way we can buy into that is by prioritizing that diversity and our love of it over new phones and faster cars and asphalt roads. And so I think if we manage to like love the world more and also not crap on it so hard, it can't be too bad.
What a great note to finish on. Thank you, and thanks to all of our panelists. That's been a really insightful, really fascinating discussion. And I hope we can all meet up at the pub sometime and have a beer and continue, because I think we've only just scratched the surface of this fascinating topic. So thank you all, and I'd like to just let the audience know that there's another Pint of Science panel tonight, which starts in 1 hour at 8:30. So details are on the Pint of Science website. The theme for tonight's panel is ethical considerations in the digital era. So there are panelists that are involved in developing AI technologies, digital solutions and policy frameworks through private, public and community lenses. So grab some food and a drink. There's time to go and grab some dinner and settle in for a discussion about how we can shape the digital era for the better. Thank you also to all of the Pint of Science volunteers who've done a huge amount of work in the last month to put these Pint AU panels and other online events together, including the very small and hardworking team of Pint panel organisers. Pint of Science is supported by volunteers, so if you're able, please leave a donation on the Pint of Science Australia website to keep this event running. And this is the first time I've been involved, but I think it's been a terrific initiative, a really great set of events. Lastly, thank you to all of the panelists once again, and to all of you, the audience, because without your support, this couldn't continue to happen. So this is all about connecting through the sphere of science, and I think it's been a great session. We'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone.